Joining us now is Martin Resch, CEO of Netography. Martin, appreciate you joining us here on News Desk today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We are talking about security solutions and their evolution so they do not fail, an issue near and dear to security practitioners' hearts. Adversaries, of course, are continuously evolving and adjusting. It seems that enterprises and vendors struggle to keep pace with them. This feels like a classic spy versus spy, constant escalation, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's very much like an arms race that we've seen really the entire time I've been involved in security for the last 20 plus years. And we're in a bit of a new era now with what we call the atomized network, where people are getting these network configurations that are much, much different than what they've had in the past in terms of these very hybrid multi-cloud environments with on-prem infrastructure.
I want to talk to you about the atomized network, but I'm curious, just if we could do some context setting. Why is it that the industry and certainly customers struggle to keep up with the bad guys? I mean, innovation is as we were talking, a game of escalation, but take a deeper cut at that, if you will.
There's a few things involved with this kind of slow failure of existing architectures, and it's really kind of fascinating. One of the big problems of security is that you've got, you're playing the game on a moving playing field, and it's moving in a few dimensions. There's the tides of technology that are constantly waxing and waning. So the platforms that we're on, motion from classic perimeter-based defense to now we have this multi-cloud defense and things like that. But then you also have the adversaries themselves that are always coming up with new attacks. So one of the big issues that you get into as a result of this is kind of architectural obsolescence with previous approaches. So for example, now we see that appliance-based architectures that we've relied on for decades are really under pressure to stay relevant in a world where we're into these kind of hybrid cloud environments, because the appliance model doesn't really work in the cloud very well. And at the same time, you've got things like Zero Trust bringing pervasive encryption to networks that wasn't there when we designed all these deep packet inspection systems 20 years ago or 30 years ago, and all these DPI systems relied on traffic being in the clear to do their jobs. So you've got these kinds of pressures, evolutionary pressures, that are happening to the vendors themselves and the technology that they've fielded, and they've got sunk costs and business models that are involved that make it very hard to pivot rapidly as a result. So what you see is this continual model where people try to adapt the existing architectures to these new problems, and the architectures do or do not adapt very well. And what we're seeing right now, quite frankly, I believe is a real lack of adaptation or evolution in the classic architectures to the modern problems that we have now.
So you mentioned the atomized network a few minutes ago. Help us understand what that is and why it's applicable to the dynamics that you're describing here.
Yeah, the atomized network was really something that kind of popped up on my radar after I started working at Netography a year ago. So I took the job. I had taken a couple years off post-Cisco, where I had been working before, before I took time off and then started Netography. As I started talking to customers and prospects, I started hearing the same thing over and over again from the people that I was talking to. We're multi-cloud, we're hybrid cloud, we have on-prem infrastructure and mobile and remote workforces, and I was like, well, yes, of course, this is the post-pandemic world that we're in, so of course that's how these networks are. But it was really interesting because after a while I figured out, this is actually something new under the sun, and what's happened is, pre-pandemic, we had these kind of early migrations to the cloud. We had committees, and we're going to move the data center in Denver to the cloud, and there's committees and people, and they have reports and readouts and things like that, and all this stuff transitions, kind of under control. And then the pandemic hit. Everybody got sent home with one order, which was just get your job done. So what did they start doing? They started standing up cloud infrastructure everywhere. And then they started tying it all together, including, I've got the shiny new cloud application, but it still needs data that's in a database in an on-prem data center. So I'm just going to poke a hole in the firewall and get that data. And now all of a sudden I've got these dependencies built between them, which leaves you in a situation where the dependencies cement these architectures in. So I said, oh my gosh, it's like you've got, your networks have atomized. They've dispersed from being things that were really under control to I have atoms of presence and atoms of functionality that are scattered across the clouds as well as in the on-prem infrastructure, and because of the dependencies, you can't decommission the on-prem infrastructure anymore. You can't nail down these cloud applications like you used to be able to, and as a result, you're into this problem now where the solutions that are out there are really poorly adapted to the actual networks that they're trying to function on.
So how do security professionals then get visibility into this highly granular atomized network?
So the way that we have come up with essentially at Netography is to use a SaaS-based solution to do it. So we are a pure cloud-based solution. We have no software or hardware to deploy, and we're living off the land by leveraging infrastructure that's already there to get data about the environments that people are operating today. So fundamentally, you've got a problem with deep packet inspection because of the kind of the twin problems of encryption and presence, essentially being able to be present in the path of packets and everything that means in the atomized network. And there's kind of two classes of vendors. There's the classic vendors that have appliances and try to stay relevant in the cloud world by having cloud appliances or by buying up cloud companies. Then you have the cloud security companies that are cloud only, and they don't even think about the on-prem world. Okay. You've got massive gaps between the functionality, the operational tempos, and how organizations are set up to consume these technologies, and as a result, I like to say attackers live in the gaps. As a result, you have massive inefficiencies in how people are securing their networks.
So this dichotomy is basically self-designed to create these gaps, these integration challenges. Is that an accurate read?
That is, right, and that's exactly what Netography was built to solve. Is essentially, we don't care where your infrastructure lives. We treat it all as the same thing. So if it's on-prem infrastructure, we operate primarily on NetFlow. So we can get NetFlow data off all your network infrastructure, switch, route, firewall, load balancer. We treat it all the same. In the cloud, they have cloud flow logs as well. We can bring it all together under one roof and tell you exactly what you've got, what it's doing, and what's happening to it without having to deploy anything to make it work. So it's and treating it all as one thing instead of this is your on-prem, this is your cloud A, B, and C.
The IT industry in general has relied on startups for years, if not decades, for innovation and new ways to solve longstanding problems. That certainly is the case in the security realm. How do you see the role of startups when it comes to innovation and adaptation with security in particular?
Yeah, startups are like the innovation reactors in the security industry, right? They drive new ideas because, to some degree, I joke around with fellow entrepreneurs. I say, they're unencumbered by success. So when you have nothing to lose, you're free to do basically anything. And as a result, startups try wild new ideas, and the ones that you've heard of are the ones who really kind of put all the pieces together and built a real company. And it's very challenging to do it because there's a lot of impediments. It's not just about building great technology, it's about building a great company. Sales, marketing, operations, finance, there's all sorts of pieces to the puzzle, but for real innovation, you typically do not see it coming out of the big companies because of the way they're structured and how their cost models work and because of the profitability expectations, the margin expectations, and things like that. Freeing up money to go build something truly innovative is extremely difficult. And you see all these large companies, especially to try to do spin-outs and spin-ins and all these kind of gymnastics to try to put money to work to build something innovative, whereas the startup community itself, that's the engine where the people go to build truly new things and these new ideas catch fire.
Sure, but you've created quite a challenge for yourself with regarding selling something like evolution and adaptation. How does Netography itself position itself to evolve and adapt as the industry and the threat landscape advances?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really interesting question because the first thing that you really need to be positioned for, in our opinion, is for the atomized world that we live in now, right? So we have an architecture for the future, not an architecture for the past. So that's very important, and if you look at what we've built, it's really a network metadata analytics platform that has a number of applications around being able to do things like cloud detection response, network detection response, network modeling, mapping, and discovery, and compliance enforcement. So there's a variety of really interesting things that you can do. So you build a classic architecture, and it stays relevant relevant for very long periods of time, sort of like, back in the old days I did with Snort, which is still, to this day, still a relevant piece of technology.
Martin, I appreciate you joining us here on the Dark Reading News Desk. Thanks for being here today at Black Hat.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
We've been talking with Martin Resch, CEO of Netography. This has been Terry Sweeney with Dark Reading. Thanks for joining us for this Dark Reading News Desk segment. We'll be back shortly.